Hi, Chris.
All right. We said, oh, hey, John. Hi.
Yeah.
How are you?
Doing well, doing well.
Good, good. Good to see you.
Yep, yep, yep.
Thank you for having me.
Like
Certainly.
your beard.
Oh, yeah.
Very nice.
If not now, then when, right?
I agree wholeheartedly. Mine is a little grayer than yours, though.
It's getting there. I seem to be going straight to white.
No, just very, very light brown.
Yeah. Get my coffee for that.
Good.
You're ready.
I'm glad to see you're comfortable enough to wear shorts.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The Zoom uniform.
My daughter asked why I had a button-down shirt on today.
Yeah, dress shirt and shorts. That's the Zoom uniform. So, well, welcome, Chris. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Ryder. Chris is the Thomas Kinnear Professor and Associate Professor of Strategy at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. Previously served on the faculty of Emory University's Goizueta Business School and Georgetown as well. Earned his doctorate in the famous BPP program, Business Policy and Planning. No, Business Policy and what was it? What's BPP again?
Well, it was actually Organizational Behavior and Industrial Relations.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I apologize. Okay.
But I'm honorary Business and Public Policy, I guess.
You weren't in BPP.
No, just by courtesy. I hung out with them a lot.
Okay. Well, yet another Berkeleyite of whatever stripe. As many of our guests have been hailing from the Berkeley PhD program. Chris studies how strategic management issues, including firm founding, competition, and survival, shape societal inequality. Interesting question. He serves as an associate editor at ASQ, a senior editor at Organization Science. He earned a dissertation fellowship and a junior faculty fellowship from the Kauffman Foundation. Was a finalist in the Organization Science dissertation proposal competition. Has a very interesting mix of publications, having published in Org Science, SMJ, ASQ, AER, and California Management Review. So just an interesting mix of publications and well-cited publications at that. So please join me in welcoming Chris Ryder. Good. So I just want to start by paying Chris a compliment. So we served on the faculty together at Emory. I was at Emory for 17 years. And if you took all the people who voluntarily left the organization and management group at Emory during those 17 years, you'd have people like Huggy Rao, Marianne Glynn, Jim Wade, Peter Thompson, Joe LaBianca. Who am I forgetting? Russ Koff, sorry. My goodness, Russ Koff, my co-author. Shame on me. I mean, you would have, not even including myself, you take a look at all those other people, you would have one of the premier management departments in the world if you pulled those people together. So, and I definitely include Chris in that group. Chris was definitely a clear up and coming star as a rookie when we hired him. And, and obviously we were heartbroken to lose Chris. But, again, he's one of the members of that group who, if you pulled together all the people who voluntarily left, you'd have a heck of a management department. So thanks for joining us, Chris. So
Thank you for having me, Rich.
oh,
It's great to see you again. We get to reconnect after all these years after Emory.
yeah, sure, sure. And I do like the beard stuff. So, I love to start these discussions by asking a question about, how did you get into this career in the first place? Because I've never heard a 10-year-old say, "Mommy, I want to be a strategy professor when I grow up." So I assume there's usually some kind of indirect pathway to this, to this career. So, what was it for you?
Yeah, I think like most of us, sort of a confluence of factors. One that's most important is that I studied economics as an undergraduate. I saw what my professor's life was like. They spent a lot of time on research, some time on teaching, and seemed to be doing really interesting stuff. But I knew I didn't want to be a PhD economist. And I thought that that's what you had to do to be a professor in a business school. So it wasn't until I went to the MBA program at the University of Chicago, and I had several professors. Probably most salient among them was Toby Stewart, who I realized, wow, you can do this job and not be a PhD economist and study very interesting questions. And so Toby was the first person I met as a student that I realized, wow, I could do work like him and be in a business school. That sounds pretty cool. And so I had a summer internship at Intel that I thought was kind of my dream job, doing strategic planning and marketing. And I realized I just really didn't care if the company did well or made money. It didn't really excite me as much as I thought. And I wanted to work on different projects. So that was a real stimulus in me pursuing a PhD.
So before that, you had worked at Verizon, right? So what was that? Was that what motivated you to go back and do your part of what motivated you to go back and do your MBA or your PhD?
Yeah, at Verizon, I had an interesting job where I basically managed teams of, I was a project manager for software development teams. When we roll out new products, we would update the building systems, put in the back-end infrastructure to support that. And I realized I didn't want to do that for very long.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that going to business school for MBA would open up different career opportunities. And it certainly did. I didn't expect to become a professor, but if I hadn't gone to business school, I wouldn't have realized I could do this.
Right. Well, cool. Well, and we are all better off for you having had that experience and coming here to join this profession. So, so tell us a little bit about what your experience was like in the PhD program at Berkeley. So yes, okay. So I see on your resume it does say organizational behavior. I apologize for missing that. So what was life like in the PhD program in organizational behavior at Berkeley?
Yeah, so Berkeley was a fantastic place to do a doctoral degree. I took classes all over campus: sociology, the School of Information Systems, the School of City Planning, public health, sociology, of course. And so I could really sample broadly from the social sciences and the various statistics course offerings all over campus. The OB group was great. It allowed me to develop my understanding of organizational theory. And then I also had opportunities to interact, as we mentioned before, with the business and public policy group, where I realized pretty early on that I was going to need to learn econometric methods to do this job. Mm-hmm. And I was going to have to hang out with them if I was going to learn it. And it was a tough experience. Every time I would present that seminar for at least the first 3 or 4 years, the BPP students would beat me up.
Oh my!
Intellectually speaking, of course.
Over methods?
Oh, identification. This was the identification revolution.
Yeah.
But it was a fantastic experience because it enabled me to internalize, the kinds of arguments I would have to address if I wanted to be persuasive in my research.
Yeah.
So Berkeley was a wonderful place to do a PhD.
Yeah. So they would give you all these, I imagine, all these alternative interpretations of your results that you would have to rule out in some way.
Yeah, that's right. And then, I got to sit in on the seminars too with, the Williamson seminar was fantastic, with Williamson sitting up in the front row, asking, key questions about the definition of theoretical constructs.
Right.
And it made me appreciate very early on the importance of precision and argument.
That's a good discipline. Yeah, I agree. So remind us again, what was your dissertation topic on, and maybe tell us how it was that you discovered that dissertation topic in the first place.
Yeah, so I studied venture capital fundraising and investing for my dissertation. I was out in Silicon Valley, in 2003 or 2008, and I figured when in Rome, study what they do there, right?
Easier to swim downstream than upstream. Take advantage of the current period.
I felt like I had access to something very interesting going on in the world. And I did. And people were very generous in terms of doing interviews. My advisor, John Freeman, was very adamant that you need to go out and talk to people and really understand on the ground what's happening, not just sort of theorize top down. And so I did that. And I thought I wanted to study decision-making in venture capital. And I realized pretty quickly that wasn't what I wanted to do. I would go interview these venture capitalists and ask them how they made investment decisions. And they would get very frustrated and they would just, look, I don't know.
At least they're honest about it.
We have a portfolio. We hope some of them hit. I can tell you some story, but it's probably not actually what happened. It's just what I remember. And it's okay, this isn't going to work. And so to try and keep the conversation going, I try and steer it to something they did want to talk about. And they love to tell fundraising war stories. Sort of, well, when we pitched the Yale endowment, we went in and David Swenson was there, and they'd love to tell those stories because when they closed a $500 million fund, that was a huge win for them.
Sure.
Right? They just claimed 2% and managed, management fees over the life of the fund. Right? And so
that adds up.
I said, maybe I should study fundraising. Talk to me about that. And so in the process of that, I found out about these brokers called placement agents that help venture capitalists raise funds by mediating between the institutions and the general partners.
What's their take?
So they take 1% of capital raised.
Wow.
It's a pretty nice job for basically trading and gossip between the institutions. Is that partner really involved? Is the key person really managing the firm? Is he up at his vineyard all the time playing golf?
Right.
This kind of information is useful to institutions.
Absolutely.
So they're willing to pay you.
So what did you learn about these intermediaries in this market?
So I realized that a lot of them had relationships, long-running relationships, on both sides of the market. Some of them had worked for, say, university endowments or public pension funds. As investment managers. Others had actually been general partners or operating partners at venture capital firms. And so they were classic brokers. They had relationships on both sides of the market that enabled them to fill a gap that was really hard to fill. I mean, imagine basically the person running the state teachers retirement system and pick a state across the country is typically a CPA, maybe a CFA. Right. They don't know anyone in Silicon Valley, right? So getting the kind of information that a placement agent can provide is very valuable to them in deciding which funds to invest, which ones to consider. And so, these placement agents are usually like 3 to 5 partners, and you raise a few $500 million funds each year, take 1%, spread it amongst the 3 to 5 of you. That's not a bad way to make a living.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, as you're describing it, I'm thinking, gee, I wonder whether it matters in some sense which side of the market these placement agents come from, whether they come from the VC side or from the investor side, and does that affect their approach or their success or anything? What did you learn anything about that?
So it seemed that everyone had come from somewhere, but there wasn't sort of one dominant source, or there wasn't some sort of role. Pre-brokerage role that dominated this market. Okay,
and no obvious pattern about, whether it was better to come from one side or the other, or whether
none that I can discern. I'm trying to see if reputation is associated with better performance by these brokers. It's the kind of thing that takes years to really for the performance to unfold and for you to judge that.
True.
So I don't have anything inclusive yet, but maybe one day.
Yeah. So it's these funds, they typically last, what, 10 years or so?
That's right. Yeah.
So you got to wait a long time to get performance results.
That's right.
So, wow. So these guys are really in it for the long term. Okay. So I often say, doctoral students can often find it easier to identify a research topic than to identify a research question, right?
Yeah.
They'll say, okay, I'm really interested in this topic. Okay, great. What's your research question? Because to really execute a dissertation well, or any research project well, you need a fairly specific research question. So was that easy for you or hard for you to find the research question?
I found it terribly hard. I still do.
Okay.
I've come up with a process that I think helps me. It's what I teach in my methods course now. And I frame it with Robert Merton's 3 fragments. He has a 1987 article where he discusses, first, establish the phenomenon, define it. What is it you're trying to study? Which seems to make sense, right? Sure. But the second fragment is to specify ignorance in a way that, what do we know about the phenomenon? What don't we know, right? What would it be useful to know? How might we reduce ignorance? And based on those first 2, we select a context where it seems like if we study the phenomenon here, we'd be able to reduce ignorance. And so I use those 3 fragments to try and identify what are people's priors about the phenomenon, and what doesn't square well with me, or what does my intuition, my observations suggest that there's something more here, and perhaps I can generate what I call differences in inferences. That is, if I reproduce something consistent with people's priors, perhaps reproduce a finding from prior research, and then I show, using my argument, how, that's true, but I show you something else. I've generated differences in inferences, reduce some ignorance, increase our knowledge about the phenomenon.
Right, so maybe some special case or some unusual circumstance, or maybe some, I don't know, some time or some place where it just works differently.
Well, ideally that it always does, or usually does, and we just haven't identified it yet. What you described, I would consider a boundary condition. But I want to show that, there's either a parallel process or there's an intervening mechanism that hasn't been previously credited in the production of the phenomenon.
Okay, so there's more to the story than meets the eye.
I think that's the ideal. And so once I do that, I start to, okay, so what's the research question that motivates that whole inquiry?
Nice. Right, and I like that framework, the 3 fragments. That's very interesting. I hadn't heard of that before, and I'm going to have to go look that up.
It's on my website. I have it.
Okay. Okay.
I'll go. Merton's article and everything. Yeah.
I'll go there and download it. That sounds great. And so when you talk about, what do we know versus not know about the phenomenon? In this case, I guess the phenomenon was brokerage, or what would you define the phenomenon to be?
Yeah. So there it was brokerage, right? And if we think about a broker as someone who connects 2 disconnected actors or 2 sides of a market, we know that it really pays to do that, right? My examples from the anecdotes before make it seem lucrative. What we don't really know is how, right? And there are all sorts of potential connections that could be realized, but some are just not feasible because one side of the market doesn't want to interact with a broker, and some are not feasible because the broker doesn't want to interact with those actors. Right. And so the opportunities for brokerage are really constrained by basically supply and demand side factors in the market. And for me, the big insight was that, I would talk to some venture capitalists and say, oh yeah, placement agents, they're fantastic, but none of them will take our business. And then other people say placement agents, we would never work with them. They're as if they were somehow untouchable. And I realized that's interesting. And it turned out that, the brokers, they want to represent the ones that are easy to represent because that's low cost. But those funds don't really need the broker's help.
Right.
And the ones that really need their help, well, gosh, that's hard work. and so the brokers don't want to take that business. And so they end up trying to thread the needle on the middle ground.
Okay.
Right. So it's neither those with the highest willingness to pay nor those with the lowest cost of service who end up getting represented. And
right. Okay.
that seemed like a really interesting insight.
So it's the hierarchy of clients, in a sense, that generates that phenomenon.
That's right. Yeah, basically the value of the service versus the cost of servicing.
Nice, nice. So so as you as you executed this this dissertation project, what were the biggest challenges that you faced?
The dissertation project was one, like, as I said, getting to that sort of research question and insight. So the research question ended up being, who pays the middleman, right, in layman's terms, right, or who do brokers represent? And I had taken for granted that was all, that just gets figured out and you just estimate the returns to brokerage.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's what you get from reading the literature. So really getting to that point, honestly, it took probably a year or two of telling the story and people telling me that's not really that interesting. We already know that.
Wow. Okay. So you had a whole bunch of other ways of framing it that didn't work because people said we knew that already.
Yeah. Well, when I was, saying, here's why I'm collecting this data, here's why I think it's an interesting setting. I remember as a doctoral student talking to a prominent scholar in the field and saying, here's what I'm doing, here's why I think it's really interesting. And he said something like, that would be a great Wall Street Journal article.
Shot through the heart. Oh,
it was, but he was absolutely right, because I had framed it sort of phenomenologically,
right.
And not sort of at the higher theoretical level, which making that transition as a doctoral student, I think it's hard for everyone. But I found it particularly hard.
Right. I understand. So, so let me see. Now, you had an interesting way of framing the work that you do. It was on that slide that I showed earlier.
Yeah.
Sorry. Pull it up again. So studies how classic strategic management issues of firm founding, competition, and survival shape societal inequality. So tell us a little bit about that identity and where that identity came from.
So this is something I've kind of arrived at by identifying what's most interesting to me about strategy or organizational theory. And I think it's that, as you'll see, a lot of my work is inspired by Robert Merton, reading his work.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of there are manifest and latent consequences of strategy. That is, the manifest consequences, obviously we want to enhance performance. We want to survive, right? We want to reduce costs or increase willingness to pay. Okay. But the latent consequences are sort of the unintended, and those are what interest me, the sort of unintended consequences of strategic action. And so, for example, we often think about like hiring through networks, right? So hiring through networks is good because we get information on candidates. We can assess fit better, identify good people, but because our networks tend to be composed of people much like us, the network-based hiring tends to reproduce the demography of an organization's workforce.
Right.
All right. And so I study this in a variety of settings. One thing I'm working on now is studying new ventures. All right. So the idea that, new ventures tend to be founded by people who know each other, and people who know each other tend to be demographically similar. And so public policy makers love that new ventures create new jobs and want to support that. And it seems like a good thing to do. But if we take what we know from the new venture creation process, well, it suggests that, they create jobs, but they do so in a way that segregates the workforce.
Okay.
By bringing people who are more alike into smaller firms and pulling them out from typically larger employers, they do so in a way that, makes men work with men, women with women, and stratifies the community's workforce by race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status. And so I've been working with some co-authors in Denmark and Portugal, trying to examine the relationship between a community's new venture employment and the extent to which its workforce is segregated. No policymaker is going to say we need a policy to segregate the workforce.
Right.
But implicitly, new venture job creation might be doing just that.
So that is interesting. Yeah, because what they normally think of as being very positive for the economy could have this, like you said, this unintended negative consequence. Yeah. So is there a solution to that problem?
Well, I don't know what the solution is. We've, consistent with my approach, we have to first establish the phenomenon. I believe this is true. I've seen descriptive statistics that suggest it's true.
Right.
I'm working on trying to establish a causal relationship, right? Presuming that we can do that, then we can start thinking about interventions.
So that's interesting. So take us through the process of how did you get from the original interest in brokerage to this interest in societal inequality? What was the, because there's, I can see there could be connections there, but I don't see that there's, necessarily a connection there.
Yeah.
So what was the path like going through that?
So the brokerage was my 2009 ASQ paper. That was my job market paper as a rookie. But the second part of my dissertation was my 2012 ASQ paper that looked at the tendency of these venture capitalists to work with people who worked at the same prior employer and went to the same school, but also to do deals in the same networks. So it was basically a way of documenting the old boys club in venture capital, of showing that these firms are basically embedding their deals in the same networks in which they embed employment. And so it makes it very difficult for newcomers to break in. And so this really got me interested in the inequality angle. How do you break into an industry? Or how do you, if you don't know anyone here, how do you get a job? Right? How do you rise to the top? So yeah, that was sort of the bridge between the inequality interest and venture capital.
Right. If you don't happen to come from Berkeley, how do you get a job at Michigan, right?
Well, I think I'm the only one of my colleagues who's from Berkeley, but yeah.
At the moment,
There are similar, there are similar tendencies in academia for sure.
That is true. So, okay. So within that identity of how do these strategic issues affect societal inequality? What are the biggest unanswered questions at this point about that topic? What do we not know about how strategy affects societal inequality that we really ought to know?
Yeah, I think there are several interesting potential lines of research, and so you already asked one, right? So if we have a documented inequality, whether that be, say, racial disparity or gender differences in attainment or something like that, we don't know a whole lot about the kinds of interventions that actually reduce inequality, and especially those that do so in a way that's, welfare enhancing for both firm and individual.
Right.
And so I think there's a huge opportunity, especially for doctoral students right now, to conduct some of these RCTs, to collaborate with firms. How can we address some of these inequalities in a way that creates a win-win?
Yeah, right.
I think that's one.
Don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right.
Yeah. And I think another would be, I'm doing a lot of work in sort of strategic human capital management now, and studying how firms can shape their applicant pools or their candidate pools in ways that allow them to diversify their workforce, to make it more representative of a profession or a community at all levels. And so one thing I've been doing with some co-authors is trying to study how different ways of pitching the employment experience to potential applicants appeals to different groups by their demographics, including not just race and gender or ethnicity, but also immigration status, experience, major field, things like that.
That's interesting. So can you give us maybe a couple of concrete examples of the differences in pitches that you would make?
Yeah. So one thing that sort of builds off my SMJ article with David Tan, that David and I have been discussing with Sekou Bermis, is this idea of exit options. that, I hear a lot from our students that, yeah, that's a great job to start at, right? Or, yeah, that's a good place that's a good stepping stone employer. And we got interested in this is, well, if people take a job with the idea, I'm going to be out of there in 2 or 3 years and onto something better, why are we trying to retain them? Maybe we should be trying to sell that experience, right? And it seems counterintuitive, right? Because we often think about retention as a strategic imperative.
No, right. And, there are many professional service firms that, actively manage their alumni network.
Yeah.
They have alumni conferences and events and stuff like that because, they can benefit from maintaining those relationships with people who've left. It brings in new business and that sort of thing.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So McKinsey, for example, it's a great way to generate business, right? Your former employees become your future clients, right?
Exactly.
So looking at the employer side, maybe we get people who are more productive than we would otherwise be able to hire, and they stay for a shorter tenure, which means that if we can, increase the rate of onboarding, well, we can extract more value from higher turnover workforces by basically appealing to what they want, which is a stepping stone. So we're trying to alter some recruitment materials that contrast, say, employment benefits, retirement, tuition assistance, things like that, versus, hey, look at where some of our former employees now are.
Right. Yeah, I'm reminded of I mentioned this on another pro seminar recently. You probably are familiar with the slide deck, the Netflix slide deck, the culture deck, where they talk about their human resources policies. Very interesting, because they say we only hire adults.
Yeah.
Right. If you're fresh out of college, go work somewhere else for 5 years. Go to Google, go to Facebook, go to Apple, whatever, and then come work for us when you've matured a bit.
Yeah, that's right.
So that kind of ties into what you're saying. So we have one of the big audiences for this pro seminar is doctoral students. And so do you have any, and junior faculty, do you have any lessons learned in terms of career progress or anything that they could benefit from?
Yeah, a lot of lessons learned the hard way. Yeah, I think that there are two things that I feel I've learned that I often share with my students and with others. One is I've entered a lot of collaborations over the years, and a lot of those collaborations I've exited or they've just sort of died on the vine. And I think that one thing I've done over the course of my career, and I'm getting better at, but certainly not perfect, is being more selective in the collaborations I do enter. And selective on criteria that are difficult to observe. Right. So I often enter collaborations because, gosh, that's a really interesting idea. I really want to work on that. And I even like the potential collaborator. And I fail to appreciate how different our research values are. Sort of, there are certain elements of my research that I want to stand out. I want to be, very careful empirically. I want to try and be theoretically precise. I don't want to submit something until I really, really feel confident about the results. And these sorts of values, I realize, are not universal. And they've caused a lot of, tension with collaborators about the timing of the submission, where we send something. And so be very selective about
we should develop a psychometric scale for this, right? We ask all these questions, and that can help with the matching, kind of like eHarmony approach.
Yeah, so that would be the eHarmony approach, right? I think that what we actually do is probably more like Tinder. We're swiping right or swiping left, right? Or at least from what I hear about Tinder, yes.
Yeah.
We make intuitive judgments rather than the sort of detailed assessments that, for example, they might make in
Yeah, but we're scientists, right? So we're social scientists. We should practice what we preach. Generate some psychometric, generate and validate some psychometric scales, and use them to match and see if that helps in any way, right?
Yeah, so maybe that's a great doctoral student project. Just create a clearinghouse, create an online platform for matching collaborators on the basis of research values.
Yeah,
that could be really welfare enhancing for us.
That would be, yeah. Yeah, right. So yeah, and it kind of fits, right? I mean, because there's things that you know about what your preferences are. And there's things that, like you said, you maybe aren't quite consciously aware of, right?
Yeah.
I've read somewhere that that's kind of eHarmony's approach, right? They say, in terms of physical attractiveness or the way the other person looks, they don't do anything with regard to that, because they figure that you know what you like, right?
Yeah. That's
the one thing that you definitely know what you like, right?
Yeah.
But you don't know is all this other underlying psychology, right? And it's similar here, right? Like you said, I would jump on this project because I liked the topic. I liked the research question. It's an interesting, right? So we know what we like in that regard. So it's the other stuff that this clearinghouse would have to focus on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe this is another parallel with eHarmony, is that I've tried to, put a delay in the decision so I don't make these intuitive judgments.
Yes.
I stall, right? And so, my joke about eHarmony, I teach the case in one of my networks classes, is that, in this country, you can buy a gun faster than you can go on a date in eHarmony. They have like a 48-hour cooling off period, right? We can't get that for firearms, but we can get that for dates on eHarmony, right? And so I've kind of instituted my own cooling off period, so I don't jump into a project just because I'm really excited at the beginning.
Right. So you give yourself let me think about it, and I'll get back to you next week and decide that.
That's right.
Something like that. Yeah, that's a good policy. I should do that too. I get myself involved in some craziness that I probably should take a week to think it through first. Check my calendar and see what else is on my to-do list before I agree to even look at these things. I have this rule that I don't follow often enough, but I wrote it down. I once had a career coach who said, do you have a set of criteria for deciding what projects you get involved in? And I was like, what? I never even thought of that. And so, she assigned me to write a list of criteria. And one of them that I came up with was my 2-week rule. I said, because I had some research projects that I worked on, and they just didn't pan out because the results weren't there. There were no results. And, and I just wish I had that time back just to, maybe to make progress on something else, but even if not that, then to just spend it at the beach or something like that, right? My life would be so much better if I, had spent that time, at the beach rather than wasting it on those projects that didn't yield results. So I had this 2-week rule of, got to be able to, within 2 weeks, generate at least some hint that there's going to be results there, right? Yeah. Some anecdotal evidence or some quick and dirty, a correlation or something like that will give me some hope that it's worth investing more time in.
That's a great rule. I think that's probably my second insight, Rich, is that, when I was trained, you wanted to quickly get to regressions.
Right.
That's sort of the way I was trained. And I think that, that's still the case for many people. What I learned from, the applied econometricians in the BPP group at Berkeley was really the power of descriptive statistics. Mm-hmm. To document these, these correlations, look at the counts, the conditional probabilities. And so this is something I now run very few regressions, and I don't do it until I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to find.
Right. And it's not just a matter of moving to sophisticated statistics, even moving to time-consuming measures, right?
Yeah.
So if I can get
That's right.
some really dirty proxy, right, or some, partial data, a tiny subsample, right? I got to be able to generate some hope out of some small piece of the data before I invest in collecting more of it.
That's right.
So
Yeah, and I think that putting in that legwork on the front end of a project is really important because but it pays off in the back end. Not just because you understand it, but rather because, we can construct better narratives for an audience.
right.
We've actually articulated our logic in a systematic fashion that, we're able to persuade people that not only is this possible, but it's plausible. And by the end, hopefully you believe it's probable. Because I've basically walked myself through the same process I'm going to try and walk the audience through.
Right. This is all good advice that I really ought to start following someday.
Well, all of us are great in theory, imperfect in practice.
Indeed. So I noticed that you've served as advisor for 6 doctoral students now. 2 of them I know, David Tan and Athena Sterling, who both have achieved great success in their own careers. And I don't know the others, but so can you tell us anything about the experience of working with doctoral students that you've learned, that could maybe help other advisors become better advisors, or anything that you've observed or experienced through the process of advising doctoral students?
Yeah, I think, my primary motivation from moving, I was very happy at Georgetown. I loved being in Washington, D.C., but in Michigan, we have a big doctoral program, which I'm heavily involved in. And I realized how much from my time at Emory, I missed working with doctoral students, right? I was very fortunate to be able to work with David and Adina. They were at the end of their doctoral program. I was at the beginning of my assistant professor position. But I really enjoyed watching them develop their ideas and go on and achieve success. And so Michigan provides those kinds of opportunities to me, but to get involved earlier on. And I think that, my approach to advising is that I try to adopt the approach that my advisor did in some ways, which was to, his model was more sink or swim than mine is. But it's really the idea of trying to identify.
Here's a life preserver and a lifeboat.
That's right. Come back to me when you have something. Yeah. The idea of trying to identify a common interest that you can continue talking about. Here's what's good. Here's what could be better. But really trying to develop an intellectual agenda. So that by the time the student leaves, they don't just have 3 papers and a set of signatures. But rather there's an agenda that they can independently pursue. And so I think that making sure that I'm investing enough as an advisor early on, and my students are insisting that I do, and I'm not just getting them involved as an RA in a project, but doing so with a purpose. This is a foundation for something that you can take in another direction.
Right.
It's very important. Yeah.
I agree. That's great input. So what's the most important piece of advice that you give to your own doctoral students?
Gosh, I don't know. I give so much cheap advice. It's hard to stratify it based on its value. I think the most important is that perhaps that, okay, if everything goes the way you expect it to with this project, what's the most important implication, right? Is it, okay, we need to update our theoretical beliefs, or we need to start conducting empirical research differently, or organizations need to change the way they practice, whatever it is. So what I try and I insist before we start any project, and I do this now for myself, is I write what I call an aspirational abstract, which is like in 200 words or less. I lay out the argument and I allow myself to fabricate some findings in this aspirational abstract. We find that, and so what, right?
Right.
And that's sort of the ceiling on what I can do with any project. And so I make the students do the same thing. Okay, if this idea pans out, what are you writing at the end? Right? Go ahead, just, imagine, be creative. What do you come up with? And if you can't get excited about that, don't go any further.
I like that phrase, aspirational abstract. It's a great concept.
It's a great way to free ourselves of the constraints of setting and theoretical precedent, and just write something that we can get excited about.
Great. Well, I sure do appreciate your sitting for the interview. I hope you enjoyed it too.
This is great. Thank you, Rich.
We will have you up on YouTube soon and make you a YouTube star.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, thank you all for tuning in and for including me. This has been a great experience. I appreciate it.
Great.